Okay, let's resume our discussion of sanctions and talk about how sanctions actually work. So again, to recap one of the key aspects of examining sanctions, it's very easy to model sanctions or to think about sanctions in the same way that you might think about war. So in terms of war, countries impose military costs on another state. In terms of sanctions, sanctions impose economic costs on another state. But again, one thing in my research that I've been able to identify and others have been able to identify, and I think it's worth really pressing the point because policymakers often think of sanctions as war and behave as if sanctions are war, is that they're quite different. And that what sanctions are doing is indirectly imposing costs by altering the incentives of individuals and altering the incentives of firms to engage in business. So what this is really doing is creating something that's known in economics as a market imperfection. It's raising the cost of doing business. It's raising the cost of conducting a transaction between individuals in the sender state and individuals in the target state. So for example, if I was a vendor of Iranian carpets, right, which are very famous Persian carpets, it's harder for me to acquire the carpets. It's harder for me to get the carpets. It's harder for me to move the carpets and get them to market without suffering through excess costs. And if I do acquire the carpets, I might be fined for my behavior, right? So all of those decrease my bottom line. In theory, if enough of those costs exist, I, as the vendor, might just abandon my business in Iran and just stop doing business with them entirely. And if I do that, I hurt the economic transactions in Iran and reduce their revenue, and ideally reduce their tax base. So in sort of indirectly, I end up harming the leadership of Iran. But the key point here is that when costs are imposed from sanctions, they are imposed on Americans. I want to say that again. They are imposed on the citizens of the sender country. Indirectly, this may harm the target state. But when sanctions are imposed, they effectively work as a tax, right? They create a tax for sender citizens, for Americans in our case, for doing business with the target. That's how they work. So if you actually read sanctions laws, I've had the good or bad fortune to read several of these things. They're passed by states and they restrict the ability of individuals and firms to do business with target states. Individuals that do business with sanctioned states may face fines or may face prosecution. Sometimes they don't, right? Since we look at the Office of Foreign Asset Control, sometimes they don't identify individuals that do these things, and they're hidden and they're done under the carpets and under the rug, it's done under the table, and nobody identifies them. But oftentimes OFAC is exerting quite a bit of effort to try to identify perpetrators and try to identify who actually continues to violate sanctions or run sanctions, and they try to punish them. Now, in theory, the threat that OFAC might investigate you, right, or in theory that the government might identify that you're violating sanctions, that's supposed to deter individuals from doing business, which might result in lost commerce to the target state. That lost commerce translates into lost revenue for the target, so sanctions indirectly are creating these costs. The mechanism is called a market imperfection. It's raising the cost of doing a normal transaction by having some political interference. So let's think about how difficult this actually is, right? Sounds good in theory. It actually is difficult for states like the United States to devote a whole lot of effort towards making sure that their firms and their individuals are actually complying with the law. You also have a situation where firms have no incentive to comply with the law, right, unless they're facing a significant fine or unless there's a significant effort by the United States to investigate. And the reason for this is because firms are engaging in transactions with the target state for one reason, and that's to make profit. And chances are a lot of these trades are lucrative. Add to it that most firms are apolitical. Theoretically, we don't think of firms as having political preferences. We think of them as profit seeking. That's very different than a government. A government is trying to accomplish some political aims or achieve re-election or do something like that. But firms are only seeking to maximize profits. And if they're only seeking to maximize profits, what incentive do they have to abide by sanctions? They're not going to do this unless they have to. And what we see oftentimes is that firms go through considerable lengths to try to continue trade, particularly if it's profitable and it's lucrative. So just as an example of this, in January 2005, Halliburton bid on a contract to drill in the Pars gas field, which is in Iran. For those of you that don't know, Halliburton was a company that was led, not at that time, but was at one point led by former Vice President Dick Cheney, who was certainly no dove when it came to Iran. And we would presume that Halliburton, which often supplies significant contracts to the U.S. military, would not want to do business with Iran, but they did, right? And interestingly enough, when this was in flagrant violation of American sanctions, they continued to engage in this behavior. It was too profitable to give up, right? There were other cases where, like, Schlumberger Limited sold drilling equipment to Sudan and Iran during the 2000s, again, in violation of U.S. sanctions. Even Israeli firms, we know there's a significant rivalry between Israel and Iran. Even Israeli firms are known to do business with Iranian firms. They do it. And that's because in the private sector, politics doesn't really matter that much. Firms are apolitical. We're talking about profit. We're talking about green. That's what we're focusing on. And so politics gets in the way of that, for better or for worse. If you're the United States and you want to be able to coerce states using sanctions, you have to be able to get in the middle of that. You have to be able to interfere in that. And you have to create enough interference so that you can deter your firms from continuing to engage in this behavior, or at least make it not profitable so they stop. So we can think about a less complicated example that actually makes the point quite well. I'm a baseball fan. You know, my favorite team is the New York Yankees. Now, this might be upsetting to many of you, but pause for a second and then come back so we can discuss this example. If we look at sanctions in the 1990s, the United States had sanctions on Cuba. And what this did was it prevented teams from recruiting within Cuba. But there was quite a bit of baseball talent in Cuba, right? So in order for this to work, Cuban players could defect to the United States, right? They could basically flee to the United States and declare residency. And when they did, they would, if they fled to Florida, if they fled to another Central American state at that point, they became free agents. But if you actively recruited in Cuba, if you actively tried to recruit and try to get players to flee, right, or tried to hire Cuban pitchers, there was a chance you were violating U.S. sanctions law. And so what happened, in order to acquire Cuban pitchers, a real disparity started to exist in Major League Baseball. The poorer teams, the Kansas City Royals, the Houston Astros at the time, they couldn't do business with the Cuban players, right? They weren't able to pay those fines to the U.S. government, right? They simply did not have the resources to do that. But the bigger teams, the Red Sox, the Yankees, etc., they were perfectly happy to pay the fine to the U.S. government and then acquire the pitching talent, right? So the implication of this, if we look at at least Major League Baseball, is that the stronger teams were able to acquire the Cuban talent, the weaker teams were not. Now, that's a silly example with baseball. But think about what that means for the market. What that means is that the biggest firms, the ones with the most resources, sanctions are not going to change their behavior a whole lot. Paying fines for doing sanctions violations, that's the price of doing business, right? The Halliburtons of the world, they're not going to care, right? ExxonMobils of the world, they're not going to care. They're just going to pay the fine and move on. The weaker firms, the smaller firms, the mid to small size firms, they're the ones that have to care. They're the ones that will be deterred from continuing to do business and sanctions. So what this tells you is that the market imperfection that's created by sanctions creates disparity, right, in the sender state amongst the sender's firms. Stronger firms can get away with it and they'll continue to gain more market share. Weaker firms will be harmed. That's the price of doing sanctions effectively for the United States, as it creates more disparity in its firms. So how do we make threats work? Let's start with that, right? For one thing we can see is that in order to make threats work, the first thing that the United States has to do, or any sender has to do, is to actually make them clear, right? So let's think about these two comparisons. One thing you could say is that we're going to impose sanctions, and in order to get the sanctions removed, Target has to improve its human rights. That's really vague, right? Or you could say release a particular prisoner. That's easier to understand, that's easier to do. So the more tangible you make the goal, the clearer you make it, the easier it is for threats to actually work. A second feature that has to be there for threats to work is there has to be commitment, right? On one hand, the US could say there will be consequences for some economic activity. That's vague. Or the United States could say, we will eliminate aid and ban the export of goods. More specific, the more specific you make it, the more likely it is that threats are going to work. And finally, institutional backing is really important if you want to make threats work, right? So the United States typically does better if it works through the United Nations rather than trying to impose these things unilaterally. So multilateral efforts tend to work better. We can observe this in the data, right? These were estimates that we did to try to examine what the probability of success were. You can see on a unilateral issue where there are unilateral case of sanctions, there's only about 0.14. The probability of success is 0.14. If you moved it to multilateral, it goes up to 0.63. Same thing here if you had multi-issue sanctions. If they were multilateral but multi-issue, 0.17, so it goes down, but multilateral, multi-issuing through an institution, you get a success rate that is estimated at 0.83, which is very successful, right? So what we can see from these data are that multilateral efforts are more successful when it comes to sanctions. This stops target states from just going to alternative markets. So, for example, if sanctions are imposed, if the United States imposes sanctions on a state and they can't consume Chiquita bananas, right, what they can easily do is just shift to African bananas, right? Or if the United States imposes sanctions on weapon exports, a target might move to Russian exports of weapons, right? So the more multilateral you make this, the more you take away those opportunities, which makes sanctions more effective. You take away that opportunity to substitute trade from the United States, which in turn makes them more effective. We can also see that throughout the years, the use of multilateral sanctions has grown. The number of sanctions in total has grown, as we've seen, but also we can see that there's more of an effort at multilateral sanctions. Put that together with the discussion of firms and their willingness to violate sanctions. If a firm is willing to violate sanctions just that the U.S. has imposed, that's one thing. But if those are also sanctions that are imposed, if the European Union states have joined the sanctions and they're multilateral, if I'm trying to move my money around, if I'm trying to do business in Iran, or if I'm trying to mobilize to try to get gas out of Iran or whatever it is, it's going to be harder for me to use financial institutions both in the United States and the European Union, which means that the task is going to get progressively more costly. So as the multilateral part ties in, it's going to be harder for firms to do business and sanctions are more likely to be successful. And as a result, we've seen an increase in the frequency of multilateral sanctions over the years as it's been identified that this is one effective way to try to make sanctions work. Similarly, we've seen that there's an increase in the number of sanctions through international institutions for exactly the same reason. One advantage of using international institutions over just multilateral sanctions is it stops states from free riding, right? The multilateral efforts can be useful, but what you tend to see over time is that different states may relax their enforcement behaviors, may start to look the other way, may start to free ride. They know that their partner, for example, if we just think about this as a case, if France knows that Germany is complying with sanctions, they don't have to as much, and vice versa. So, but if it's done through an institution, institutions tend to take control over these efforts, tend to internationalize this effort, enforcement efforts become more internationalized, and so it minimizes the existence of free riders. So we're seeing more sanctions through institutions, which also increases the probability to succeed. We're also seeing an increase in the frequency of smarter sanctions, right? What smarter sanctions do are their efforts not just to target an economy bluntly, right, by imposing sanctions on the whole, right? So there's not just an increase in the price of trade, right? It's not just an entire blockade or something like that. Smarter sanctions tend to target particular individuals or particular commodities, right? So in recent sanctions, the United States has often targeted leaders and their coalition in particular to try to make their ability to do business harder. So we're seeing a lot more of those. That grew up in the 1980s. It really ballooned in the 1990s. We're seeing a downward trend here, but generally the trend is up. That we're seeing more and more targeted sanctions. Smarter sanctions are becoming an increasing part of the portfolio. So that's one piece of the puzzle here, right? So if we consider the Gaddafi's renunciation of terror in 2003, right, that was something that was arguably influenced by sanctions, right? The United States imposed sanctions on Gaddafi in the 1990s, right, in the 1980s. And if we look at that case, Gaddafi finally renounced terrorism in 2003, but that was probably more affected by the observation that the United States invaded Iraq and the imposition of economic sanctions. Same thing is true when we look at South Africa's dismantling of apartheid. They were influenced by harsh American sanctions in the 1980s and the divestment movement, but they were also probably increased or influenced by the Cold War ending and the increasing cost of suppressing the African majority. So, as I mentioned, sanctions can succeed, but they're typically aided by some other factor, right? So sanctions have some effect, but the effectiveness of sanctions isn't necessarily just sanctions alone. They're typically affected by some of these other events that are happening around them, like, the invasion of Iraq and like the end of the Cold War. So success often requires help from less predictable forces. So let's take an example of this, right? Let's look at recent sanctions on Russia, right? So these were imposed in response to the annexation of Crimea and support for militants in Ukraine, which were the little green men that were going around causing instability within the region. This was done in March 2014. It was expanded to Russian officials and energy companies in the summer of 2014. These sanctions were multilateral, they're supported by many countries, and these sanctions were painful in a sense because Russia was the key supplier of gas to the European Union, and that's a pretty important commodity. So these actually hurt the European Union when the cost of doing business with Russia was increased in this way. So initially, because this was a cost to the European Union for doing business, the expectation, or Putin's expectation, was that the European Unions would eventually crack. Right? The Europeans would eventually abandon the sanctions effort, and all he had to do was hold firm for a period of time. But what's interesting is that these sanctions caused early problems in Russia's stock and bond markets, and these were compounded by the collapse of the global energy market in 2014. Not as bad as recently, where oil was trading negative. But at this point, oil was trading high for a large period of time in the 2000s, right? Oil was trading at well over $100 per barrel, right? Again, compared to now, where oil is very, very low. What that meant is that if oil was trading that high, Russia had a significant budget windfall. But when energy collapsed, when the price of energy fell, Russia's expectations for its domestic budget were that oil was priced in at about 100 or to $120 per barrel, but now all of a sudden oil was only worth 50, right? And so the amount of revenue that Russia had steadily collapsed. Coupled with that, when revenue collapses, what many of the Russian oligarchs wanted to do was to move their money into more stable assets, to take it out of rubles, put it into other stable assets. They tend to do that anyway, but that movement is accelerated as Russia's economy started to suffer. But they couldn't do that because of these sanctions. These sanctions actually made that harder. Right. And so as a result of this, sanctions prevented Russia from trying to save its money. Also, because energy trades are typically settled in US dollars, sanctions prevented Russia from getting them. And so the consequences got dire. The Russian ruble collapsed. It lost about 50% of its value, and inflation increased significantly in Russia. So Russia started to feel considerable economic pain as a result of these sanctions. This was working in conjunction with the collapse of oil. Sanctions wouldn't work alone. They worked in conjunction with the collapse of oil. But sanctions really exacerbated the effects of oil collapsing on Russia. So that's how sanctions work. They typically work together with something else that's exogenous. Now, these sanctions were touted as successful and were magnified by falling energy prices. And because the Russian economy was heavily dependent on oil and gas exports, almost all of their exports go to the Europeans. When the prices fell, when the price of oil fell in 2014 and sanctions were on, Russia faced considerable budget deficit, right? And so, in short, sanctions combined with market effects to really harm Russia, and those were looked at as successful, right? But alone, they wouldn't have been. Combined with these changes in the energy market, they were very successful, and they compounded the pain of those changes in the energy market to the Russians. Now, so this is part of a longer term trend. If we look at Russia, you can see that several of these changes are happening. There's a net decrease in the amount of flows in by capital from the private sector. The exchange rate collapsed. GDP collapsed. So there's some rebound after 2014, and inflation started to surge within Russia. So all these things started to happen within Russia where they had significant problems that were exacerbated by sanctions. Again, now think about what this did. The sanctions harmed Russia, They also harmed the Europeans, though, right? Because again, European traders couldn't get access to that energy, right? And the other part of this is that sanctions, right? If we think about what they were doing, in particular recent sanctions, since the financial crisis, economic sanctions have increasingly targeted the ability of countries to settle trades using something called SWIFT, right? Which is an international system for settling international exchanges. Some of you may have used it, some of you may not, but that's typically how international exchanges are settled. One thing that the United States now has the ability to do after the financial crisis is to really monitor what is and what is not going on in SWIFT. And so in order to make sanctions work, what the United States can do is to shut down access of a target country to SWIFT, which makes settling these trades very, very difficult. That means that a country that's trying to settle trades can't get dollars, which again, 90% of transactions in the world are settled in dollars. So if you're out of that market, it's going to be much harder for any firm to do business with you. And as a result, the firms won't. This has been something that made the Iran sanctions very effective. It was something that was making Russian sanctions very effective. And it's one of the reasons why sanctions just generally are becoming more effective for the United States is that if you can target the ability of firms to settle trades, right, then all of a sudden that cuts out the ability of firms to even make any profit at all, right? So they just don't do it. But the issue here, though, is that if you shut out the Russians from making trades, if you shut them out of SWIFT entirely, they're not able to do their business in dollars. There's still demand to do their business, right? It's become a lot harder, but they'll have to find another way to settle those trades. And so what we're seeing Russia doing is trying to make moves to operate outside of American currency, outside of American dollars, and outside of Western institutions. It's also placed Putin in a sense of siege, right? Since Russia is going to continue to weaken under sanctions, right? There's going to be an incentive to hold on to what gains that he has in Ukraine, right? So sanctions are hurting Russia, but they won't necessarily solve the problem entirely. And they create the shadow of a new issue, which is if you can't settle trades in American dollars because of sanctions, the incentive is going to be to move out to an alternative currency, an alternative method to try to settle these trades. That moves the world away, right? The more that the US uses this, the more countries are going to be moved away from using American dollars, which we've talked about the consequence of that, right? The United States wants countries using American dollars, wants countries in its financial system. The more sanctions it imposes, the more countries will start to gravitate out of that, right? So that's the trade-off. The US can exercise considerable power because of its place in the global financial system. But the more it exercises that power, the more it's going to push countries to leave that financial system, which in the aggregate weakens the United States. Same phenomenon you can look at with Iran, right? So the US has sanctioned Iran since 1979, has now reimposed the sanctions that are imposed by terminating the JCPOA. But since 1979, again, if we focus on that period, American sanctions were leaky, right? And the European states rarely complied with this. By 2010, though, because the United States was now monitoring things through SWIFT, right, and because this was harming the ability of European states to do consistent business with Iran, the European states chose to align with Obama's sanctions on Iran. And the sanctions then were intended to compel the Iranians into entering into some form of a deal that could control its pursuit of a nuclear weapon, right? This came for two reasons again. Like the Russians, the Iranians were really suffering from the collapse of oil prices here, right? So the Iranian economy was really harming, and it was really harmed, and their ability to settle oil trades was being undermined by the use of sanctions through SWIFT of the Obama administration, right? So the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act really hit the Iranian oil sector quite hard. So those were motivations for the Iranians to get to yes, right? The popular account, again, is that the Iranians were devastated by sanctions. Oil blood was the lifeblood of their economy, right? Most of their transactions are in oil, but oil can't be easily sold, right? It can't be easily traded because, again, oil is typically traded in dollars, right? But as a result of these sanctions, the Iranians couldn't get any dollars, right? Firms couldn't use dollars to purchase Iranian oil. So because that was squeezed out, Iran had to start settling its oil trade in gold bricks. Stop and think about that. Iran was trading oil for gold. Gold is wonderful in a lot of ways, right? But it's not something that's easy to trade. It's heavy, it's big, it takes a lot to try to move it there. And it's not something that can convert because if Iran can't convert oil into dollars, it's going to be hard for it to convert gold into dollars. And so as a result of that, Iran suffered from a 40% inflation rate, which caused it to lose subsidies to the poor and caused its middle class to collapse. And so if we think about that, sanctions in conjunction with the falling price of oil, again, pushed this to succeed, pushed Iran to enter into the JCPOA, right? And so what we can see if we look at success is that consumer prices went up as a result of the sanctions. And we can also see that the unemployment rate started to go up as a result of the sanctions, but it was already steadily trending down to 2014. But then after the sanctions were imposed, these trends started to reverse. So if we think about this, the thing that really harmed the Iranians more than anything was the growing oil market, right? The North American fracking boom, the refusal of OPEC to cut oil production, that rapidly collapsed the value of Iran's key asset. And so when the price of oil fell, the cost of conducting oil trades became higher, right? Or the cost of conducting oil trades for the Iranians was high, the price was low. So the willingness of anyone to engage in these transactions went down. And so the Iranians really started to suffer. And the Iranians continue to remain in very difficult shape as a result of this. Once the JCPOA was removed and revoked, once the Trump administration pulled it off, the problems are still there, right? Since the price of oil has gone negative, which means Iran's profits from these things are very, very low. There's already an enormous supply, so the willingness of traders to violate sanctions and do business with Iran's not there. Simply put, there's nowhere to put the oil, right? The capacity is gone. And so and then you add the coronavirus into this, you add COVID-19. What's happening here is that there's already a bad economic situation. Sanctions are just making that worse, right? The sanctions themselves may not be working, but sanctions are worsening an already painful situation for the Iranians. So in this case, right, prior to the COVID incidents, Rouhani signaled a greater willingness to negotiate. Khamenei did too, like the Ayatollah did too. Sanctions were seen as a barrier to repairing bad economic conditions. So there was a deal where there didn't seem like there would be one before, right? How would Iran behave when its economy improved? Well, by all indications, they were complying with the terms of the JCPOA until that was revoked. So if we look at all of these factors together and think about the process that makes sanctions work, imposed sanctions tend to work better when they're multilateral to an institution, when they're costly to a target, and when they're assisted to some extent by some luck, by some random forces that may have nothing to do with the sanctions. They may augment the effect of sanctions, like the collapse of oil, but sanctions didn't cause that. While these conditions can improve the chance of success, there's no guarantee, right? So we have a success band of 27.2% to 56.3%, roughly speaking. But again, I want to raise this concern with you, and I really want you to think about this, right, in terms of the discussion. One possible downside of sanctions is that they push states out of the financial system created by the United States. They push states away from using American dollars, right? Which means that they start to leave the U.S. sort of sphere of influence, if you want to think about that. That might get states, again, the threat of being pushed out of the American system, that is significant, right? Again, 90% of transactions are settled in dollars. Getting pushed out of that is painful, very, very painful, right? But the more states you push out of this by using sanctions too much, by sort of relying on sanctions so much, the more states you sanction, the more incentive there's going to be to try to create some alternative settlement mechanism. Maybe euro, maybe RMB. Those don't look like great alternatives right now, but who's to say what might happen in the future, right? Maybe Bitcoin, right? Maybe there might be other ways to settle these trades. And so there is a significant danger that in using sanctions too much and pushing more and more states out of the financial system, or threatening to push states out of the financial system, this might destabilize the place of dollars in the world economy, which is critical to maintain the U.S. security posture. That's not a big threat right now, especially with COVID, because there's no alternative out there. The dollar's the only thing there. But once states start to learn to live without dollars, they can move on, right? And at that point, the ability of the United States to maintain its influence and to maintain its stature and its place as the world's dominant economy, that might start to weather away too. So I'll stop there in terms of the discussion of sanctions. That's a point I really want you to think about. Does too many sanctions, will that lead to a push away from the American financial system, and what are the consequences of that? Think about that one, right? I think that's an important point, especially going forward as the U.S. uses financial sanctions at an increasing rate.